Welcome to the second episode of Couch Co-op, the second part of our look at the Legend of Zelda series. I'm Drew, and for the second half, we will be looking at the 2D Zelda games, and we're going to be crowning a champion for each of Chris's three ways to rate a Zelda game: the overworld, the underworld, and the items. Let's get rolling. So we spent a lot of time talking about the three-dimensional games, almost exclusively if you consider that the DS games are also part of that three-dimensional. Let's bring it back to the roots. You know, that spirit of adventure you liked so much in the in the original two-dimensional game, and let's focus on the all of the pre Ocarina of Times, that epic game.
Well, Ocarina of Time was the fifth in the series, so why don't we just start with number one, the original Legend of Zelda.
That relates so much with the fact that Ocarina of Time was the fifth. I'm very proud of you.
Well, by it being the fifth, that just means we have four to talk about.
Right.
I mean, if you were in my head, that made a lot of sense.
I don't think anybody's in your head, Chris.
No. All right, well then why don't I start? Ocarina of Time was the fifth in the series, which means there are four games. Ocarina of Time is about an ocarina. Which brings me to my next point. The original Legend of Zelda.
It's about an ocarina, which is a sub-weapon. At least it is to the fullest voice.
Alright, so let's pretend I never mentioned the Ocarina of Time at all. So why don't we start at the beginning? We'll start with The Legend of Zelda. The original for the original Nintendo Entertainment System.
Well, if we're still looking at the older games by that triad you mentioned of overworld, dungeon, and items, I would have to say that the items aren't that good in the original Legend of Zelda.
You're telling me a ladder to cross small scapes of water is not awesome?
Oh, not at all. But
how about a raft that only takes you to two places in the whole game?
You'd think you'd put the raft over the water and use it like a ladder. I mean, it's not like the ladder ever went over things that weren't water, you know?
That's true.
But I actually spent most of my time just getting stuck in the ladder in certain dungeon rooms that had, tiles you couldn't ordinarily walk on, but there was nothing to go over. I just happened to brush the edge of it.
Yep.
But, that's the way the design in the later Zelda dungeons worked is, short of exclusively designing a dungeon around the item found within it, it was still very important to puzzle solving for the section of the dungeon that happened after you got the item, and also useful in expanding your ability to explore the world. And to a great extent, the weapons of The Legend of Zelda did not do that thing. The only thing, for example, you need the bow for is I don't remember the name, but it's the only weapon that can kill the spider boss. With the eye that opens and closes. Goma, yes, you have to use an arrow to kill Goma. Goma is the boss of the sixth dungeon. The bow is well off the beaten path and easy to just miss in the first dungeon. And if you think you're getting items in all the dungeons, well, you picked up the boomerang, and so you're not looking for another one. First time I ever played Legend of Zelda, I had to eventually come back for the bow because I just plain missed it.
I have to agree. The whole design of the overworld does not lend itself to any sort of flow to the next dungeon. There's nothing that suggests through an increase or decrease in the difficulty of enemies. There's no obvious way of knowing where the dungeons might be, or when you get to a dungeon, until you actually walk into it and see the number associated with the dungeon, where it falls along the line.
Yeah, you can easily wander into any of the first three dungeons when you start the game, and I suppose that that's okay in the sense that you're not wandering into dungeons 6, 7, and 8 near
I
the
think it's only
beginning.
6 is the real one. Is 6 the
Six.
like the super hard one?
Oh, 6 is the super. That was the one where they introduced the wizard robes, and it is amazingly hard.
They didn't
I always did.
introduce the wizard robes. They beat you up with the wizard robes.
Yeah, I almost always did the seventh dungeon uh, before the sixth one, just so I'd have that extra heart going in
Yep.
there.
I think when I did my playthrough, because I finally played through and beat the game without in-game cheating. I used game facts and maps and stuff because I am a cheater. Um, I did the same thing. I made it as far as I could, skipping the sixth dungeon, and then had to go back through the sixth dungeon because it's so brutally hard. It's actually harder than the final dungeon, the one with Ganon in it. Because although there are the wizard robes in the final dungeon, there's not nearly as many rooms with them as there are in the sixth dungeon. But there's no direction. I think. I mean, it's a well known meme about the old man at the very beginning, the opening cave. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this, which is a sword that you're still alone with. But from there, you still have no idea where to go. There's no. I don't know if maybe there should have been with proper translations, but there's no villagers. There's a couple of people. There's some old women and some old men, but there's nothing that helps direct you to where you need to go. So,
Yeah, but when we were little kids, we eventually figured it all out. We eventually found where the dungeons were, and you know, tried not to get roped into doing them in a completely backwards order. But I still really can't get over how useless the items in the first Zelda game were. I mean, first dungeon, you get the bow. You don't need it for much longer. It doesn't even help you get to a dungeon until the sixth one, so maybe that was kind of a clue, because they also would kill the statues that come to life in a single hit,
that is true.
and so that might be a hint that you needed the bow for the sixth dungeon. But if you didn't have it, you would not glean this piece of information anyway. The Wizard Road ROM was almost completely useless. Speaking of the sixth dungeon, the item you get in the third dungeon, the raft, is, it's you get a free piece of heart, or if you're really foolish, a medicine of life instead on on the overworld, and then you go to the fourth dungeon with it. So that's actually one case of a clear indication. But fourth dungeon, you get a ladder, which occasionally is useful going through a dungeon room, and that's it.
Yep.
And also collecting a piece of heart in the overworld, uh, heart container in the overworld. So, and you go to the sixth dungeon, you get the wizard robe wand, which is nowhere near as good as your sword, even and nowhere near as good as the bow for that matter as a projectile weapon. And then you keep going, you go on to the seventh dungeon, you get the red candle, which is useful if you're trying to brute force figuring out which trees burn.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it. I mean, the blue candle was all you needed to get into the eighth dungeon. The eighth dungeon, another oddball with two items. The magic book, which allows the wizard robe wand to create fires, or which you will almost always fire a wizard robe wand at the doorway you wish to leave in a dungeon, and then either take damage from your own fire or have to wait for it to go out to leave the room, or at least that's just what I did. And the other one is the big key. Also useless because the dungeons just gave you all these keys, you could buy them anyway, and that really destroyed any potential sense of flow for Death Mountain, because you would run to a locked door and you just go through it. You wouldn't have to explore different rooms and for the key. I mean, there were so many rooms in Death Mountain. And one of the reasons why it failed so massively as a final dungeon, other than just being big and having a couple of unique enemies in it, uh, the least of which being the boss, of course, but You never really had to explore. You just wandered around aimlessly until you found the silver arrow. If you're lucky, you got the red ring too. And then you found Ganon and, beat the game. You don't have to go through rooms in a specific order, really.
You don't have to
Because
go through most of the
you don't
rooms.
even have to kill most of the enemies. The only time you ever need to kill an enemy is if, a door seals on you that you have to go through. You don't have to look for keys. You don't have to look for anything.
Yep.
And wow, I'm really down on this first Zelda game
I
now
know
that I'm actually
you brought
verbalizing
us
it.
you brought us down a notch.
Wow.
You hate Zelda.
I never really noticed until like
So
wow.
I actually think the proper successor in style to the original Legend of Zelda would be Link to the Past. Everyone knows
Well,
Adventure of
because
Link.
it wasn't Adventure of Link. Yeah, do your metrics of overworld, underworld, and items really work with the Adventure of Link? Because there were hardly any items to speak of.
Well,
Or would the magic spells take the place of the items?
I'd like to come back to the Adventure of Link since we're already on the subject matter of what we felt were failures in the original Legend of Zelda, and see how Link to the Past individually fixed every single one of those problems. So I think it lends a good perspective to see how the Legend of Zelda has grown from its previous iterations. Like we were mentioning with the original Legend of Zelda, there is a massive overworld, and within that overworld, you have various dungeons in different parts. Unlike the original Legend of Zelda, you actually start with a miniature tutorial where you get the basic fundamentals of navigating the area around you. You get directed to a place where you eventually you have your first sub weapon. You actually start with your lantern. You get a shield, a sword, and it helps you through the very first dungeon in Hyrule Castle to get you used to the mechanics. And then after the first part of the campaign, there's a town where you can actually interact with people. You can talk to an elder, and he will give you directions on which part of the massive world map to travel to for the first part of your adventure. You go to the far eastern portion of the world. You get 2 items. You do get the bow in the dungeon, the first dungeon, yes?
Yes.
So you get the bow. You use it immediately for the boss. You also get the running shoes just outside the dungeon. And those running shoes are required to knock a book off of a shelf in the town. That book then allows you to translate a prayer on the second dungeon's entrance. The second dungeon gives you a power glove that allows you to lift rocks that are blocking your path to the third dungeon. The third dungeon gives you a moon pearl. Is it Dark World or the Golden World?
Well, it's both.
All right. Allows you to go to the Dark World without turning into a pink bunny. After accomplishing all of that, you're not only getting those items that allow you to progress in a flow throughout the whole world map, you're also getting 3 very important key items that are used to allow Link to draw the Master Sword. It's not just found in a cave or in a
Under a gravestone.
under a gravestone,
Because that's where I keep my old men with swords.
right? There's actually a Lost Woods, which you have to navigate the Lost Woods. You take those 3 key items to the Lost Woods. You draw the Master Sword. Now you can go all the way back to where you started from in Hyrule Castle, where you first learned of your quest, and you could progress further than you did at the beginning. Everything works in a flow, and
It just builds.
it
Off
builds.
of
It builds. It doesn't hold your hand.
It doesn't tell you that you need to go to Dungeon 1 and then Dungeon 2 and Dungeon 3. It's, clever enough that you're going to say, this is another example of rewarding gameplay here, rewarding exploration, not just wandering off the beaten path and finding a piece of heart or a cache of rupees or a gold scatola, but, I got this new thing, I want to use it wherever I can find a place to use it now. And that's exactly how you find where the next thing is.
Absolutely. This is also the start of what is considered the Zelda formula. You have 3 dungeons, you grab a Master Sword, you go and beat a dungeon in the middle to bring you to a dark world, whether that dark world is a time travel, like an Ocarina of Time, whether the landscape doesn't change in Wind Waker, but the basis for what you're doing, whether it's 7 years in the future, like an Ocarina of Time, or it's the Twilight Realm in Twilight Princess, you have this beat 3 dungeons, do a thing with the Master Sword, beat 7 or 8 dungeons, kill some version of Ganon or Ganondorf. Obviously, Link to the Past was the first to do this, so this was groundbreaking and original at the time. But it was a formula that worked very well, and it allowed you to explore different parts of the Dark World. The Dark World, Light World dynamic was a puzzle in and of itself. You had a mirror that allowed you to return to the Light World from anywhere in the Dark World, but you could only get to the Dark World from very specific portals. So you'd have to find a combination of using a portal to the Dark World, finding a spot in the Dark World that when you use the mirror, you'd be in a new spot in the Light World that you couldn't get to from anywhere else. And that dynamic allowed you to explore further and further from one dungeon to the next throughout the second half of the game. You pair that with the different items you got in each of the dungeons. The first dungeon in the Dark World, you get the big hammer, which is now called the Megaton Hammer or whatever. The item that you get in the dungeon is used to defeat the boss of the dungeon, and then that item is key in making your way to the next dungeon on the overworld.
And that's one thing that not all the Zelda games have actually gotten. All of them after this formula fell into place, that, an item was key not only to solving, the last few puzzles in a particular dungeon and also defeating the boss, but then that item has another use in the overworld to guide you to the next dungeon. Some of the other games actually locked the location of the next dungeon behind plot coupons instead.
Yes. Link to the Past improves on every single aspect of the original Legend of Zelda. And I think that's one of the things that makes Link to the Past considered by many people to be the best game of the franchise. And it just felt like a complete whole game. It was not too short, not too long. It was something you could get 100% completion on, and the whole game flowed You were required to do a little extra exploration because some of the things that you needed were not necessarily in dungeons. Sometimes you had to go a little bit out of your way. But the world wasn't so massive that that was a daunting task. It was a very reasonable task, and you always wanted to explore as far as the boundaries would let you. You'd end up finding, the hurricane medallions, the quake medallions, the Zora's flippers. These are all
You know,
things that,
the glade with the boy and his flute.
yes, absolutely. Your nature to explore would be rewarded in every direction with something extra, something that was not only worth your time, but required to complete the whole game. So it was a very complete, concise package of a game. Nothing convoluted and unnecessary, and at no time did you feel like you weren't getting enough.
So I know we haven't talked much about the Oracle games or the Minish Cap. They do deserve their due diligence, but the reason why I'm mentioning that they're existing is because of the next question that I'm asking, which is, if you had the whole series to choose from based on the triad by which you rate Zeldas, which would you say is the best of them all? And the reason why I bring up the extra handheld games is because when it comes to dungeons, I actually want to say that the Minish Cap had the best dungeons in the entire Zelda series. They were so varied, so creative. The themes fit perfectly, and there were tons of ways to use the sub weapons and other items that you picked up.
I have to agree the Minish Cap did an excellent, excellent, excellent job with its dungeon design. It used a wind, I believe it was called the Bellows. Maybe it wasn't, but it was like a wind bag that was added a physics element. It also did a great job of utilizing the Minish world. In the dungeons, you'd go from regular size to micro size, and knowing how to use that was very key in solving many of the dungeons. Where Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, a lot of the games, you have your Dark World, your Future, your Twilight Realm. Very rarely do you go back and forth within the confines of an individual dungeon. In the Minish Cap, all the dungeons require you to go between the two different realms.
Yeah, there really wasn't any other Zelda game that integrated, its dual worlds, quite as tightly as the Minish Cap. I mean, I remember the sixth Adult Link dungeon, the Gerudo Valley dungeon, being so memorable in Ocarina of Time because you got to also go back and do part of it as young Link with a very interesting fight against a Dark Knight. The thing is about the Minish Cap is, unlike most of the Zelda games, in which you eventually unlock it, and it's a major point of the story progression. I mean, this happens like in the introductory segment. The Minish Cap is, the Minish world is with you every step of the way, with overworld exploration, with dungeon exploration, with finding items, with finding extras. Even when you go to crazy locations for dungeons like in the sky, there is still a Minish world in the clouds.
Yes, that's true. Even though Ocarina of Time only doesn't really have much with the time travel aspect within an individual dungeon, there is a dungeon in Skyward Sword that goes back and forth something like 1,000 years. It's pockets of time throughout the dungeon where you're walking along and in one part of the dungeon it's 1,000 years ago and you just walk out of that time sphere and all of a sudden it's 1,000 years in the future. So it's either a vibrant, beautiful utopia or it's a desolate wasteland. You have this mineral that only exists in the past, and as long as that mineral is around you, you're in the past. And manipulating where those minerals are, you're either in the past or in the future in that dungeon. It is one of my all-time favorite dungeons in not just Legend of Zelda, but in any adventure game I've ever played. The dynamic is just amazing. They do something similar with the same mechanic, but you're on a ship in a desert. But it's only a desert in the present. 1,000 years ago, it was an ocean. But if you have that same mineral on the bow of the ship, directly in front of the ship is 1,000 years ago. So in front of the ship is ocean. So you're basically sailing an ocean through a desert. It's a really fun mechanic, and it's one of those parts of Skyward Sword that make it an amazing, great game.
So, what do you think has the best overworld? And I'll let you go first this time because I'm such a nice guy.
The most to do in an overworld is Skyward Sword, but it's a very restrictive overworld. You start from a central hub in the sky, and it drops you to one of 3 sublocations. But those sublocations are so full of life, adventure, puzzles, that it's hard to really block down what the best overworld is. I can definitely say Spirit Tracks is the worst. Ocarina of Time is nice, but it's a little bit barren. Twilight Princess is a little bit bigger, a little bit more going on. You have horseback archery and horseback combat, but it's like big for the sake of being big. I honestly kind of like Link's Awakening. I don't think there's any place in Link's Awakening where you're not doing something silly or fun. And everywhere you go, there's some sort of silly mechanic that is required through your awkward inventory management. So it's kind of hard. Like, I would much rather just ride around shooting moblins in Twilight Princess than scrolling through items in Link's Awakening. And then sometimes I'd much rather just sail around in Wind Waker. It's kind of hard to nail down what I would consider the best overworld because they all have such unique overworld styles.
Yeah, Link's Awakening was definitely replete with overworld gimmicks, be it the signpost maze, or the part of the game where you had to deliver the chain chomp, basically, and that really greatly changed how you got around places. Or, picking up a chicken to fly.
Yes, that mechanic is a great mechanic that has been repeated, and it's actually one of my favorite parts of Ocarina of Time is using the chickens to get around.
But what would I say? I asked you first because I wasn't quite ready to go.
Well, let me keep yammering. I'll stall for you a little bit, and I'll talk about the fun stuff you get to do in Twilight Princess's overworld, because you can include some of the side quests in the overworld because they're part of the overworld. It has, I think, one of the funnest parts, and it reminds me of the sliding levels in Mario 64. You have a snowboarding level that's part of the overworld. You have a raft down the river mini game that's part of the overworld. You have an entire sky that you can fly around in Skyward Sword, but the flying mechanic's a little bit flawed, mostly because of the motion controls. I think just dual stick controls would work better. I really love exploring A Link to the Past.
I'd like to give an honorable mention to the Oracle games, which we've sadly haven't talked much about, particularly Oracle of Seasons, because Oracle of Ages has the time travel mechanic, and that's a lot more like Ocarina of Time in that respect, but a bit more involved because you go everywhere in the two time periods in order to progress. But Oracle of Seasons is you're standing right there, you find a tree stump in the overworld and you stand on it, and then you use the Rod of Seasons and you change it from spring to winter to summer, and there are different obstacles that come up or clear away, like pile of leaves might cover up a pit, or there might be a new raised walkway or a barrier someplace during the winter, and so on and so forth. And that was a very amazing, very dynamic overworld, even though most of what you were doing in the overworld was all about just changing the seasons rather than having like other puzzles going on there. But so an honorable mention to that. But I would have to say, I think the best overworld in Zelda, perhaps, is coming right back to A Link to the Past for the reasons we discussed earlier, that it was so well integrated with the items, and that even though it wasn't strictly on rails, the exploring you wanted to do at the time inevitably led you to the next part of the game. And that is a masterful piece of design work, to just have it go.
I think I want to mention two more honorable mentions.
Well, you already have 3 favorites, so why not?
Well, I know. I'm going to favorite all the games, except for Spirit Tracks. I want to mention Majora's Mask, only because neither of us has played through it, but I have seen a lot about it, and know that even though there's not a lot of overworld exploration, Termina?
I think it's
Terminia?
Termina.
Timeland has a very vibrant and interesting town. The town itself is its own overworld, that it has a lot going on, and of course there's the time aspect where, depending on the time of day or which of the 3 days it is, different things are going on. Now, I personally haven't explored it very much. I've only run around it a little bit, but I do want to mention that an overworld doesn't necessarily have to be big open fields or a forest or a mountain. You can have a large town that has to be explored. Like in Ocarina of Time, before you get out into Hyrule Field, your overworld is the Kokiri Forest. You got the Lost World, you got the Kokiri Forest, you have the little sub-dungeon where you get the sword, and then you have the little path that leads you to the Great Deku Tree. That is its own little overworld, where it in itself is its own sub-game.
Well, it's your training wheels for, seeing how the whole rest of the game unfolds.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to mention a little bit more about Wind Waker. Everything feels good and looks good in Wind Waker, and each island is set up really well. Those islands happen to be spread way too far apart on this vast ocean of annoyance, but when you're actually on an island, the overworld exploration on foot is a lot of fun, and is very engaging. Especially when you sneak up on pigs and you can pick up and throw pigs. That's a lot of fun.
Well, mostly because they don't gang up to kill you afterward.
No, that's true. Not like chickens. Cuckoos.
Yeah. So, all right. So here, the third leg of your stool here, items. Which game? Well, I already talked about which game had the worst items, surprisingly. But which game had the best items, like the greatest variety, the best integrated, the most effective?
Most of the games that come after Link to the Past take something from Link to the Past and make a change or an improvement. With the regular hammer, a couple of the games have a megaton hammer that does pretty much the same thing, but is also used as a super strong weapon, but it doesn't do much else. Um, Twilight Princess has that amazing spin dreidel of death thing. It's a lot of fun, but you can't use it anywhere else. Uh, Skyward Sword has an incredible dual wielding grappling hook. I think everybody's generic favorite item in any Zelda game is a grappling hook. I mean, it was one of the coolest things in Link to the Past. It was one of the coolest things in Ocarina of Time. It was really cool in Twilight Princess because they had the dual wielding thing, and in Skyward Sword, it's the same thing. And there's parts in Skyward Sword, like the Canyon of the Crescent Moon at the end of this long desert stretch, where there's what would be a quarter-mile stretch to scale, where there's just a couple of off in the distance targets, and you actually have to navigate this whole thing in air, going from hookshot to hookshot, dual wielding hookshots. I'd have to say the hookshot is the best single item, and I think Skyward Sword makes the best use out of that item. It also, Skyward Sword, has the best use of bombs, because you have a different scale, like you can lob them, you can throw them for distance, you can do a lot with how you throw the bombs. You can also use your flying beetle to carry bombs around corners, down corridors. When working, I think Skyward Sword has the best items and sub-weapons.
Well, I'm going to Link's Awakening actually myself, and
Right.
the reason why I do that is that we can almost include Link's Awakening and its descendants, the Oracle games, as right in the list with Skyward Sword and the Phantom Hourglass as games in which the playstyle was very much so defined by the system they were on.
Mm-hmm.
And on the Game Boy, the particular limitation was having two buttons. And, compared to other games, it wasn't really that much of a limitation. They actually liberated the use of the A button from being only the sword the entire game. And you had a brief list of items. There were only 12 items in the whole game. All of them were insanely useful almost everywhere. And all of them had a lot of new uses. Like, for example, the shield went from being this passive thing you carried around and maybe a fireball from a Zora would bounce off it, to something that you used actively. You would hold it up, and it wouldn't just cover part of your body anymore. The whole direction you were facing was covered. You could bring it up. You could use it to push enemies around, and they really bought into turning the shield into an item. And that meant not having it sometimes, so that was the strategic decision you wanted to make. You wanted to have your magic powder and a bow for this particular dungeon because they were the most useful items. Fine. You don't need you to have your sword and your shield up. You don't need to have other things up. It was great. It had a jumping mechanic very organically using the Rock's Feather that was a much better method than, say, the ladder for going over single gap spaces. But also they did something that I don't think that they've done in any other Zelda game, which is allow combinations of special items. You combine the Pegasus boots and the Rock's Feather, you get a running start and you just soar over a whole bunch of space when you jump. You take the bow and arrow and the bomb, going back to your beloved variety for bombing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you attach that bomb to the arrow and you launch this deadly missile. The last Zelda before Link's Awakening was on the Super Nintendo, which had a lot more buttons and a lot
Yes.
more things to do with the controls. To regress back to the NES number of buttons and then finding a way to do so much more with them than was done with the NES Zelda games, and it remains one of the most unique play styles for the whole series, and in a good way.
On that note, one game that we haven't actually mentioned, only because I don't think either of us really consider it like a game in the series, is the Four Sword Adventures. It's more of an outlier that uses the same characters, but in Four Swords Adventures, you also have those. You don't always have the same items. You have a variety of items, and depending on the dungeon you go into, you have, items on different pedestals, and you set one item down and pick another item up. So you don't even have an inventory. You can only have one item at a time.
And
And
the game is basically just a series of challenges using particular items.
right.
And, there's some treasures you can't collect or areas you can't access unless you might, solve an item related puzzle to gain access to yet another item.
Right. But then I mean that game is more of just a cooperative showcase of fun. It's like a party game almost for cooperative fun. There's no real story. There's not even an overworld. You actually just pinpoint on the map which place you want to warp to. So it's a fun game, but I definitely consider it an outlier. One game we really haven't mentioned very much, Adventure of Link. Um, it actually started the hammer. It had a hammer before A Link to the Past. Uh, what did it really? What did it have
Well,
for items?
the items were kind of a mixed bag. I mean, in future games, magic spells were considered items, so I'll include those in this. But most of the things that you would get in Link to the Past were passive abilities, like you pick up, the lantern, and then you can see the enemies in the caves. Then,
Mm-hmm.
or you picked up the raft, and it would take you across. Or you picked up the boots, and you would just be able to walk on certain water tiles. There were two items that you could actually use on the map. One of them being the hammer, which would chop down trees or crush rocks, and there were really only two or three places in the whole game that was useful, and even in only two or three places where the whistle was very useful as well. And that was the other thing you used. And other than that, it was really your actions were improved by the use of the magic spells and the up thrust and the down thrust that you would use, because certain spells like the fairy spell, the jump spell, were necessary to overcome challenges in the dungeons following when you'd be able to learn them. So it's not quite as traditional, but I do think that the item question still does apply to the Adventure of Link.
Okay. Um, Obviously, Adventure of the Link being the second game in the series, people see it as a great outlier, but it was the second game. So when it came out, it was 50% of the population.
And it only became an outlier after the style of the first game won out.
Yes. Once Link to the Past came out and basically took everything from the original Legend of Zelda, improved on it, they decided top down was the way to go. The style for Adventure of the Link never really got picked up again.
Yeah, I mean, you see a little bit of a hint of it in the Hyrule Temple stage in the adventure mode of Super Smash Bros. Melee, which really
Yes.
led me to the thought that, it would be interesting to remake The Adventure of Link as a Smash Brothers Melee adventure level thing.
That would be amazing. I understand how old the game is when it came out, how games were made then. I could never get into Adventure of Link because of, I mean, it's brutally difficult, and it's not a fun difficult where you feel like you can keep going and you can persevere more and more. It has a weird life counter, like it has lives and game over as opposed to just a counter that tells you how many times you died. In all the games that follow it, if you die, you just start again and you get one more number added. So it counts up the number of times you died, but there wasn't like a set number of lives and then you had to continue. You go back to the beginning.
Well, there was a counter. You just, had to die 3 times before it went up.
Right. Like in any other Zelda game, I could keep playing it and keep playing it and I would persevere and get further. But I never felt like I could do that the same way with Link to the Past. Because it seems like if you weren't good enough, you were never going to get good enough. You have like a 2-inch sword, the patterns of the enemies, the constant onslaught of enemies it was overwhelming. If they could just take the entire game and update it so that it was just more playable using the Smash Brothers engine so that you're playing it with the wild and crazy Smash Brothers style. It had some things going for it. It had an amazing soundtrack. The battle music, the overworld music is pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff that Zelda 2, Adventure of Link, had going for it, but I always felt that it strayed too far from the original formula, and even Nintendo realized that it didn't work because they never went back to a lot of those formula items.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of weird. I see that The Adventure of Link has a lot in common with a lot of, games of that era stricken by the number 2.
Yes.
That there is the idea, since, despite several, earlier systems, Atari, the Odyssey, and so forth, not a lot of games had garnered sequels. And they didn't really understand how to do sequel escalation properly because it hadn't really been done before. They didn't think that just having the same game but different was going to work at all. And so you have progressions like Castlevania 1 or Zelda 1, and then you go to the second game in both of those series, and it's a little different. And in some cases, in many of the same ways. For this particular example, and then you go to the third game and of each series, and it's back to the basics of the first one, but expanded so greatly. I mean, we talked about how, Zelda 3 grew it all, and that grew so much from Zelda 1, and Castlevania 3 grew so much from Castlevania 1's different player characters, different paths, crazy new level mechanics, and so on and so forth.
You find the same thing with the American releases of the first 3 Mario games. Mario 2, which I think anybody who's actually going to be listening to this knows that Mario 2 was Doki Doki Panic, and it was just a Mario skin put on another game, but that created a whole different type of Mario game. And then Mario 3, even though it added in a bunch of stuff, felt a lot more like the original Mario.
The one interesting thing about the way Mario turned out is it totally wasn't that way in Japan, but Mario 2, unlike Zelda 2, ended up actually having a tremendous influence on later games. Like, for example, the iterations of the Mario Brothers in Smash Brothers. You have Luigi, who has a higher floaty jump. The princess has the levitating from the USA Mario 2, and you even get that as well in some of the newer platforming games like Super Mario 3D World.
Yes. But you don't throw vegetables, and you also don't fight Wart.
Yeah,
Mouser hasn't really returned.
Neither has
not as many
Tri-Clyde or
Hydra
Fry
heads.
Guy.
Yeah, I mean,
But
obviously, someone's
all the minor enemies came back. The Bezos came back. The Shy Guys came back.
yes,
Even that
yep.
damn mask came back.
Oh gosh, yes.
So,
We
what
digress.
we digress. One of the big debates for the Zelda series, though, very much in the similar vein of say Final Fantasy VII versus Final Fantasy VI, is A Link to the Past the best game in the series, or is Ocarina of Time the best game in the series? And we've definitely gone over a lot of high and low, a lot of high and high points for both games,
Yeah,
not so many lows. I mean, the worst thing we've said about Ocarina of Time is that like Hyrule Field's a little too empty. Ooh.
yeah. There's also that owl that asks you questions, but
Yeah,
yeah.
well, you can blame Link's Awakening for that.
Yes, we'll do that. I I think I would be more inclined to go through Link to the Past, and I find this with a lot of Super Nintendo games. They age better. First generation 3D games age horribly. They're blocky, they're clumsy. The game mechanics have grown up in the last 20 years. There's been so many improvements in 3D gaming since Ocarina of Time or Final Fantasy VII have come out that sometimes when you go back to the actual original version, it's it's not unplayable, but it's not nearly as crisp and as fluid as you remember it from your childhood. That being said, the Ocarina of Time just got an update and re-release on the 3DS, and that smoothed out some of the problems. It slapped a fresh coat of paint on it and brings it back, and it makes it very playable again, which just makes this decision even more difficult yet again.
It's not just Ocarina of Time that can be brought forward 20 years with a fresh coat of paint, though, because it's happened to A Link to the Past as well. And I'm not just talking about porting it to the Game Boy Advance and then adding sound clips of Link yelling from Ocarina of Time. No, we're talking, of course, about A Link Between Worlds.
We don't have to worry about what's better, Link to the Past or Ocarina of Time, because the answer is Link Between Worlds.
A Link Between Worlds has done so much for, Link to the Past, which was already a contender for the best, but so many of the things that The Link to the Past did right over the original Legend of Zelda, A Link Between Worlds has taken another step forward. The most obvious of these moves is a completely new to Zelda way, again, of looking at item management. You have access from just about the beginning of the game, to any damn item you want, and you explore the game with your item.
Absolutely.
What dungeons you go to, what parts of the overworld you explore, and you can do this by taking the items out of the dungeons.
That's what you can do. And what another thing that's amazing, we'll get back to the items, but I'd like to talk about the dungeons and the world map and how, like A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, the Minish Cap, you have two worlds. Obviously, it's called Link Between Worlds. And you have a mechanic of turning into a painting on a wall that brings you from Link's normal world to the dark world from Link to the Past. This is actually a direct sequel of Link to the Past. In this upside down, backwards version of Hyrule, affectionately called Low Rule,
I think Tim Burton picked that one out.
yeah, it does. It does smell a little Tim Burton-ish. Low Rule is similar to the Golden Land or the Dark World or whatever you call it from Link to the Past. you use this mechanism of being a painting on the wall not only to change from high rule to low rule, but also to access different parts of dungeons. So, like the Minish Cap, where you need to use the mini effect to get to different parts of dungeons and different parts of the world, you also have the Dark World, Light World, where you're using that different mechanism to also travel between high rule and low rule. You interact in this way from dungeon to world map, throughout the world, throughout dungeons. It's something that you need to use from early on in the game all the way to the final boss.
It really is an example of one of the things that makes Nintendo Nintendo, one of those little master strokes in their toolbox that keeps games with yesterday's themes relevant in today's world, is they can take a simple gimmick in an overworld, a game setting largely copied and pasted from a game that was 20 years ago. They add this one little gimmick, the ability to crawl along the walls. Like, in the end, that's really all it is. Just you can crawl along the walls and come back out of them. And it completely changes the entire game. You've got to experience it for yourself if you haven't done it yet, because it's just beyond my ability to describe how amazingly effective a change-up this is. I mean, not to mention, like, the dungeons, with a few early game exceptions, the dungeons are 100% different once you get past the Eastern Palace.
Yep.
Which, was the first, real dungeon in the original game anyway. And even then, it's a little different thanks to your ability to walk around walls. You explore it, and I think it was meant to kind of show off how it changes things compared to the original game, that you conquer that dungeon through in a completely different way. And I'm not talking about, Ocarina of Time Master Quest going backwards. It's just such a different experience with that one extra travel ability called upon early and often.
I think what it also does, by having that Eastern Palace be your first dungeon.
We said earlier that you could tackle the dungeons in any order, but the game does force you to go to the Eastern Palace first as an introduction to the item renting system.
Is it starts you off assuming, most likely properly, that you have played Link to the Past. Not that it's necessary, but it is a direct sequel and it's a very beloved game. Most people have played it. You start in familiar territory and you think you're going to be okay, and you get there and then it 180s on you. It brings you to a place you think you know what you're doing, you think you know the formula, you think you're in your comfort zone, and all of a sudden, you have no idea what's going on, you don't know what to do next, and you have to figure it out. You know you have different items available to you. You know you have different places you can go because you've probably played at least half a dozen Zeldas before, but you don't know where to go next. You don't know, well, should I go to the desert? Should I go to Death Mountain? Should I go to Lake Hylia? You know all the places. You just don't know when you should go to them.
And the brilliance of that is that when do you go? Anytime.
Whenever you want.
The little shop set up in Link's house, a nice, easy, central location in the game. And you buy, you rent. As many of the items as you can, and that determines your exploration path. It also adds to replayability because you'll face different challenges trying to tackle different dungeons with different items other than, whichever one or two happen to be mandatory to that dungeon, which are very helpfully, usually necessary to get to the entrance, and regardless of whether they are or not, you'll see a little stone effigy of, what item is mandatory to complete the dungeon right outside. So if you don't have that, you can make a note, go back and rent it, move on to a different dungeon you're better equipped for, or run in and just see how far you can get without it, which usually isn't very far.
No, sometimes you can't even enter the dungeon at all, so.
Yeah. It's really divergent to the Zelda formula, because the Zelda formula says, apart from beat 3 dungeons, then beat 8 dungeons, is you go into the dungeon, you get the item, and you use the item there.
Right. It tells you what dungeon to go to, and then you get the item. Instead, it just says, take any item and find the dungeon it goes to.
Yeah, which allows for very open exploration in a land that used to be closed to exploration. Like the first time you played the game, I mean, one of the things that I liked so much about the items in the overworld in the original Link to the Past is the way that it just naturally flowed you through exploration. Here, you can explore in any order you want to, not because there aren't any barriers to exploration. They are, but you can explore in any order you wish with that same experience. You bought the Power Glove first. So you're exploring and you're finding places where you can use that glove, and they will eventually take you one of the places you need to be. And when you get there, you don't see a sign that says, "I'm sorry, this is Dungeon 7, you have to turn around." You just go in and do it.
Yep. And that, again, like you were saying, adds a challenge of what I did. I made it to low rule, and I thought, why don't I check out Death Mountain? Why don't I check out the snowy hellhole that is Death Mountain in low rule? And I tried to beat that dungeon first. And I got my ass handed to me. But you can do it if you want to, and if you try really, really hard.
Yep. Might want to pick up a few hearts on the way there, though.
Yes, it definitely gives you the opportunities to challenge yourself if you want to skip around and do the harder dungeons first. And it also has a fantastic Master Quest version, which it doesn't change anything layout-wise in the game, but it doubles the difficulty as far as you take twice as much damage, and you have to dole out twice as much damage, so you are a weakling in your second playthrough. And you really have to take your time, think about which dungeons you want to go to first, make sure you're picking up the armor when you have the opportunity. You have to actually plan ahead and use a strategy, because there's several enemies that can one-shot you throughout the first half of the game.
Well, it's not without its mercy, though, because it greatly increases the potency of the offensive potions you can get from the witch.
That's true.
So those make a great oh crap button. But, you don't exactly get to carry an endless supply of them.
So if we go back to my metric of the three major aspects of what you expect from a Zelda game, the overworld that you know and love, some things are in the exact same places just like they were in Link to the Past. So you have an absolute rush of nostalgia if, like you and I, you played Link to the Past when you were a kid, and probably again throughout your adult years, you probably played it once or twice after that. You have places that feel right to you, they feel familiar, but you also have a whole nother layer added to the world. So your overworld is actually even better than Link to the Past's overworld.
It's filled with new puzzles simply by adding the wall walking mechanic.
The wall walking mechanic, and also because it's on a 3D system, the 2D puzzles actually have a 3D element in solving them. And you find puzzles in the middle of the world map all over the place. And then the low rule version is also phenomenal. It just like the Dark World or the Future or the Twilight or the Minish World, whatever the case is, it has an amazing counterpart. It has some of the most brilliant, innovative, and fun dungeons. It has a large variety of items in a very unique way with a rental system that you can later buy them. There is a way to upgrade your weapons that is part of another side quest. The little mini octopus thingies. There's 100 of them in the world. Just like the gold scutulas, except instead of creepy spider enemies, they're adorable little baby octopodies.
With this whole advent of choice and free will in a Zelda game like never before, I mean, once you've collected 10 of them, you pick which weapon you want to boost. You don't get something in particular.
Yeah, and they're pretty legit boosts, too. Like, your bow goes from shooting one arrow to shooting 3 arrows, so you can actually kill 3 enemies at once with your bow, because it shoots out at an angle, 2 of them. You can get a really big bug net. Okay, that's probably the last one you should try and get. There's also new weapons that you probably haven't even thought of, like the sand wand that allows you to bring up pillars of sand in the middle of the desert.
Again, has brilliant applications with the wall walking mechanic, because one of the things you can do in the desert by making these pillars is that you extend where the wall is from other platforms and can just go across there. And the same thing with new and exciting uses for the ice rod.
Yep.
Because when you go into this 3D magma place, jets of lava come up. Again, you can freeze them, walk around them, and come out the other side and continue on your merry way.
Absolutely.
But I have to say, some of the hiding of the Scatulas was just plain weird. Like opening a bottle of bugs on one of the magic bean patches to spawn a Scatula was pretty esoteric, whereas all of these
Little octo babies.
Yeah, where all the little octo
Mini
babies.
Miyamasa Mimi's.
Mamma Mia.
Sure.
They're all hidden in plain sight, but there's always something you have to do to pick them up, whether that's, trying to find a creative way to use one of your items, or even, use your new ability to cling to walls. I mean, one of the most brilliant uses of the mechanic that I saw, there was one of the octo babies just embedded in a wall, and you couldn't get at it. And what you did was you merged into the wall, you walked behind the octo baby and merged out, and it came with you.
You do that to a turtle, too. All 3 metrics I give through the roof scores to. Plus it has that little octo baby side quest. It has a weird monster baseball side quest. It has cuckoo chasing. It's got tons of mini quests all scattered throughout the whole world.
Well, mini games is hardly a new thing to The Legend of Zelda, but they really do shine in this game. I particularly liked, how they changed the digging game. That it's in the same place as it is in the original Link to the Past, but they make a twist on it. I mean, not only is the terrain much more varied, so having the right equipment can drastically change what areas you can dig for rupees and find other items in there. Very, very valuable. But also, there's the little gimmick of the fact that they don't tell you how much time is left, and if you go over, you get nothing.
Yep.
But if you get very close to the deadline, it gives you increasing bonuses to the point where it triples your payout if you do it in less than half a second. And being somewhat musically inclined, I just listened to the music.
That's exactly what I did.
And I figured out what point of the song was 30 seconds in, and I'd always, when it got close, I'd walk back to the entrance and just wait to talk to the timekeeper until right before that hit, and I would just get ridiculous amount of rubies every time. Not that I really needed them at that point in the game, but it was fun.
Yes.
I mean, there was a reason to go back instead of, unlike the chest game where you just, once you found the piece of heart, did anyone really go back and play that again?
I would hope not. That would be stupid. There's one thing we haven't talked about at all yet, and one of the funnest aspects is the challenge on the top of the mountain.
Another great source of rupees, too.
An excellent. It actually, if you don't max out your rupees by completing that quest, you probably did something wrong. What would you call that? Because it's not a boss rush.
Well, no, it's not quite a boss rush, but there are bosses involved in it.
There are bosses, a lot of
Yeah.
mini bosses, a lot of just generally hard enemies.
Yeah,
And
it's a lot of, you go through 30
it's a gauntlet.
floors.
It's basically a gauntlet of pain.
Yeah, each
torture.
one has certain enemies on a certain floor arrangement with certain hazards and obstacles, and your challenge is to get through them all. I do believe there's something of a random aspect to it as well.
I honestly don't remember if there is a random aspect.
Because I remember going through it more than once, and that enemy progression was different, but that might have just been different challenge levels rather than having more than 30 floors to choose from and,
That's true.
and putting out certain ones.
Speaking of putting out your mom,
You don't need to brag.
my therapist tells me I need to mention it more. That challenge is even progressive. So you start off, you fight 15 rooms, and then you fight, is it 30 rooms after that?
I think 30's the top.
It's just 15 and 30? Or is it 7, 15, and 30?
I don't know.
I don't remember.
We could totally look this up and pretend we knew all along.
We could. Just don't tell the people on the podcast about it.
Shh.
Be very, very quiet.
So
So I'd say, in conclusion, the Legend of Zelda series is amazing. It has a wonderful, varied formula that any game can tweak and manipulate to make itself a special, unique, individual game that has its own beautiful qualities. Nintendo is not afraid to try drastically new things, and more often than not, they knock it out of the park. But I must say,
or at least into the bird.
right, their most recent game, Legend of Zelda: Link Between Worlds, has been their best effort. It is, in my opinion, hands down the best game of the franchise.
You don't have to speak for yourself. That's my opinion too.
All right, well, but we're not speaking for everybody. We're
Yes,
speaking for anybody who matters.
Yeah. Yes.
All right.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that covers just about all the bases, unless we want to talk about the CDI, which we don't.
We don't want to talk about the CDI.
Nope. So that's a wrap.
All right.